Hello, Toby, and welcome back to Beyond the Best. So we've been away for, I don't know, what seems like a lifetime.
A little hibernation.
A little hiatus, forced on us by just being crazy busy at work, I think, rather than not wanting to do the podcast, but by overwhelming popular demand, people literally emailing us on a sometimes monthly basis to demand that we're back. We've decided to come back and do season 2 of Beyond the Best. So, and this time you'll notice we're in the same room and we're also on video, which is amazing, isn't it? So we've decided to record Beyond the Best on VHS, as well as on audio tape as well, which is
and you can get your record with running LPs as
exactly. So on vinyl as well for those of you that need it. So just a quick introduction for those of you that are new to Beyond the Best. So this is the 90 podcast. It focuses on innovation, and although we focus on innovation in insurance, what we try and do is take the best of innovation from the wider world. Think about the examples of where we're seeing innovation that's truly pushing boundaries, and talk about how that could apply to the world of insurance, how an insurance company could be better than the best in the business. So this is episode 1 of series 2, and today, Toby, we are talking about...
We're talking about incentivizing long-term benefits. That's a catchy title.
It is.
I know.
Wow, you've picked a killer for episode 1, so yeah, excellent.
I thought I'd get things moving. So I think the most obvious place to start with this is probably health and wellness. I think it's the most tangible thing. And I think it's about saying, are there things we could do today to improve the outcome down the road? And I think with health and wellness, that preventative care in the US could save 7.6 billion annually in healthcare costs.
I don't imagine it'd be the same level here in the UK, but you imagine that just being able to incentivize people to do things that would have a benefit later on down the road would certainly be hugely beneficial. So, yeah, I can see the logic.
And I think thinking about incentivizing long-term benefits are more, I guess, a longer horizon on view. CSRD and the new EU reporting mandate is basically forcing companies to start thinking about this a bit more broadly, thinking about longer horizons, implications of their business on society, on people, on the environment, and their products, and starting to put numbers against this stuff. You know, this is proper detailed reporting. So I think companies are now starting to think a lot more about incentivizing long-term benefits, how we think about the environment. You know, I think there's the stats out there that for every $1 invested in renewable energy, that's going to give you a $4 return on societal benefits.
Yeah.
So it's about thinking, what can we spend and do today to impact tomorrow, and how does that work, and who does it well, and what can companies do to start thinking about some of those things?
For me, this is such an interesting topic, because certainly when I talk to the younger people in my life, and I won't mention the particular child that lives in my house about this, but there is almost nothing I can do to incentivize him to do something now that won't benefit him now. But I think what we're talking about is there are a number of cases where we know that making a small sacrifice in the short term leads to some significant gains in the long term. So yeah, I'm interested to hear a little bit more about some of the stuff that we've got on this.
And when we talked about it initially, I know you had some good points, particularly to this next question I'm going to ask you. But I guess we talked about healthcare, we've talked about the environment. Why is this important to insurance companies?
So, do you want some stats on this, or would you prefer me to give you my gut feel first?
We'll take the gut first, and then we'll move on to
okay. So I think ultimately there's a couple of things here, which I think is, you know, if we can incentivize people to do things today, they might not feel the benefit of today, but actually will in the long term. I feel that will eventually reduce the cost of claims, because I think, you know, we're likely to get better outcomes in the long term, particularly with the health and wellness piece that you were talking about. If we can make people make a little bit of sacrifice today that ultimately allows them to lead healthier lives, we won't be paying out as much in claims. I mean, you know, you've mentioned the US health insurance piece there, but I also think this ultimately makes things better for people as well. Mm-hmm. I think making a small sacrifice now that means I don't get as sick later on down the line, or that my car doesn't fall apart later on down the line quite as quickly, it doesn't just help the insurance company, but it actually helps people as well. So I think it's got that kind of dual dual outcome. And this is going to sound really cheesy and American and kind of, very not very British of me, but I think ultimately, being able to do this stuff, make small sacrifices today, makes the world a safer and better place for everybody. I think, that kind of mentality of we need to work a little bit harder today to make sure the outcomes are better for us in the future. You've mentioned renewable energy there a moment ago, and that's a great case in point. It might be a real pain to have to put solar panels on your roof, and it might feel like, I'm feeling that in my pocket today. But ultimately, if your children are going to be able to breathe cleaner air later on down the line, then it's absolutely worth doing. So, yeah, I mean, that would certainly be my gut feel.
No, I think that's a nice way of putting it. But I guess, and one of the things we'll probably talk about later that you put out there is how do you do it? Because it's tough for people to think ahead. Thinking about your children down the road.
Yeah.
Drinking, breathing cleaner air.
Yeah.
That's not very, getting your hands around it. So I guess, are there any stats, as you mentioned, that kind of say why now and why we're talking about this today a bit?
Well, Toby, you're pretending that we don't have statistics on this, but you know well and good that one of the things we do prior to the podcast is prepare some stats. So I'm just going to take a quick look at some of the stats I prepared here. So a survey that was done recently revealed 85% of global insurers have prioritised or accelerated wellness initiatives. And 70% are creating insurance-linked wellness products. So I think we can see that actually there's a trend in that direction. The other really interesting stat we pulled out was around this kind of growth in corporate wellness. And the corporate wellness market is currently valued at about $61 billion. So
big number,
very big number. It's projected to grow to $85 billion by 2030. And I think what that says is that there's a significant investment in employee wellbeing programs. Another interesting stat to pull out is around preventative service and particularly how they're being used, preventative services. So although a number of these preventive services are available, stats are actually suggesting that the utilisation of them remains low, and actually there's a need to try and make the services that are available, make people more aware of them and promote them and make sure people are able to actually use them. I guess the other thing just on that is that actually it varies quite widely from region to region. So I know when we sat down and did this, we looked at, okay, well, how much are some of these products and services utilised in different parts of the world? So we looked at places like Vietnam, I think it was it Vietnam? Or maybe it was Taiwan. I think we were looking at, Taiwan, we were looking at, where we said actually some of these preventative health services are used by about 30% of insurance customers.
That feels pretty good.
Which is decent. If I said actually, nearly 1 in 3 of every one of our clients is actually trying to take action to prevent themselves getting sick, that sounds great. But in places like China, we've seen it less than 7%. So there are a number of kind of, differences in the way that people are utilising this, even in places that are relatively geographically close to each other. And then I think just maybe the last stat that I'll leave us with here is to do with the US. And this really interesting stat, only 1 in 4 adults aged 50 to 64 and 1 in 2 adults aged 65 or older received the recommended preventative care that they needed. So I think, again, that's super telling, actually.
Yeah, it's crazy. I think it's saying, I guess what you're pointing out here is that there's a time to do it because it's not working as well as
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think going through some of these stats and kind of seeing not just the differences, but the fact that you've got people that clearly need some of these preventive services that aren't actually getting access to them is really telling. So when we sat down and talked about this, we said, okay, well, who's doing this really well? Is there an example of a company that's really able to do preventative services really well, or kind of so yeah, I'll pass over to you, Toby. Why don't you tell us who today's best in the business is?
So we're outside insurance here. We're actually outside of the realms of companies as well, interestingly.
Okay.
We're looking at a small town. So I apologise to everyone out there for about to butcher the pronunciation of this. It's a town in western Romania. They're called Cluj Napoca. And they've got a lot of attention for what they've done. It's the local council. They're not trying to make money. They've got, I guess, a very different set of outcomes they're trying to achieve, which maybe helps them in this space. And I think it certainly does when I've thought about this. But they launched an innovative health ticket initiative, which basically encouraged people to take physical activity. They were trying to incentivize long-term health benefits, but also just good behaviors in people. And what they did was they effectively said, if you can do 20 squats in a minute, you can get a free bus ticket. It's quite simple. I think when we were chatting about this earlier, you rightly said, if you were stood at the bus stop waiting around because you're there early, you're waiting, if you could do 20 squats and get a free bus ticket, you'd do it.
I do have to just apologise here, Toby, first of all, for your pronunciation to any Romanian people listening, and second of all, to anybody that has to picture me squatting at the bus stop, because that's a horrifying thought, even for myself. So, yeah, I mean, this sounds absolutely crazy, but what a great initiative. I think this is super interesting.
And I think there's a couple of things, I guess, when I was reading about it and probably boring you about it, telling you about them. It was initially designed as a 2-week pilot. They were just going to do this kind of for a short period of time, just as a kind of, I guess, awareness thing rather than actually doing it for too long. But they had such high participation rates that they carried on. So from September to December, so they ran it for, 4 months?
Yeah.
4 months. Yeah, I'm struggling here. They basically recorded approximately 1 million squats.
Really?
So they gave out, and this is a very small town, they gave out 55,000 free bus tickets, which equates to nearly 1,900 hours of squatting. That's an active small town in Western Transylvania.
Amazing.
And I think what they did well, and what led to it kind of working so well, was effectively the engagement they had was beyond the customers. This was all funded by kind of partners they got in and companies who were willing to, I guess, sponsor the free tickets, and they saw it in their interest. But the way they did it, they basically had a machine at the bus stop that would record you and count you doing the squats, and then pay for the ticket. So I think it's a really nice example of someone who's doing it well, someone who is starting to think about how do you incentivize a long-term benefit, and what value can you provide to a customer to do it differently. And I think the fact that they're not profit driven, that they're a civil body, probably helped them in terms of thinking about that and thinking about doing things differently. So I think what I'm going to kind of, I guess, hand the microphone literally back across to you and think about is, how do you, when you're kind of starting to think about, incentivizing those long-term benefits, how do you understand if customers are interested in that benefit you're trying to drive?
So this, first of all, I should say, this is a super interesting case study. I love the fact that we've got a municipality that's trying to make the people that live there healthier by squatting for bus tickets. I mean, it's absolutely crazy, but also just a fantastic example of what people will do to give, sacrifice a little bit of short-term pain to actually benefit from something. So I think, your question there, which is, how do you understand whether they're actually interested in doing this sort of stuff, is pretty simple, I think, which is you've got to test it. There's no way of knowing actually what people will or won't do for, to gain some of those benefits, and also whether or not they're actually interested in what you're offering. I think one of the things that the stats that I badly ran through a few minutes ago sort of tells us is that there's a massive variance between what people are interested in. I think if you take the example of Taiwan and China, two countries that are actually, relatively close to each other geographically, but actually the needs of the customers there, or the wants of the customers, seem relatively different. And I think the only way you can truly know whether or not what you're offering is going to resonate with your customer base is to test it, is to actually take it, build a quick, easy, a cheap version of it, and actually put it out there and see whether or not people will interact with it. I genuinely don't feel there's any replacement for truly testing what you're assuming is going to work.
Yeah, and I think the follow up from me thinking about testing and the way you link and build things, and I guess talk and interact with customers about it. When I think of that example, like, yes, there's a link, but it feels quite distant. You get a free bus ticket and you squat.
Yeah.
It's not as though you're getting a free bus ticket for pushing the bus or cycling for free. So I guess Do you think there needs to be a link between the two?
So again, I think this is a super interesting question, because I think if you ask people, the initial gut feel would be, yeah, of course. If you want people to live healthier lives, then you should incentivize them through things that are going to make them healthier. But I think what we've learned with this example is that actually the prize doesn't necessarily need to be something linked to the kind of, the outcome that you want to achieve. So I think, although my gut feeling would be, yes, you probably need to link the two, the evidence is saying that no, you don't need to. The thing that I think that this particular case study allows us to understand is that there is clearly a level of value that people will accept for some short-term pain. And in this case, what we're saying is the value exchange is, I'm willing to give you a minute of squats if you pay for my bus ticket. That's the value exchange. And I think this is the thing that I would encourage companies to get into, which is the two things don't necessarily need to be linked in terms of, just because I do squats, you give me a gym membership.
Yeah.
You could give away a bus ticket to get people healthier in the short term. But it's understanding what's the amount of things that people, or the amount of stuff that people are willing to give away in the short term, and what's the appropriate benefit or the appropriate reward they expect for it. And those two things don't need to be intrinsically linked. But there does need to be that perception of value from the consumer, that actually the thing that I'm giving up in the short term that you want me to do is not as valuable as the thing you're giving me back in return. And there's, I think, I talked to you about this as we were kind of preparing for this podcast. There's a whole bunch of value-added services I get through my bank, through my insurance company, through my phone company, my TV provider. But I don't necessarily see any of those things as particularly valuable. There are very few of those things that I actually feel represent a fair value exchange. So I kind of see them as, well, they're trying to make me more loyal by giving me this stuff, but I don't really care about it. I think what we're seeing through the example that we've got here is actually, if you get that balance right between what you ask for and what you give, there's the opportunity to change people's behaviour and actually to do what we talked about earlier, which is to create some long-term benefits through doing some short-term sacrifice. So I think, just as we try to round things up, I guess one of the things that you talked about is this example involved setting up a machine at a bus stop.
Yeah.
I think you said. So for me, that sounds like something. I initially talked about, you need to get out there and you need to test this and you need to try it. That sounds quite expensive.
Yeah.
So for you, how do you get to the point that you reduce the cost and I guess the risk of launching something like this?
Yeah, so I think the two are intrinsically linked in terms of when you launch a new product or try and do something, it costs money. You might have to build things, buy things, but it also costs time. This is people's time, and on a balance sheet, time is often kind of one of the biggest costs for a business. So there are a number of ways I think, if I look at this, that I might have gone about it slightly differently. That's not to say it didn't work. It paid off. They picked something in it and they smashed it, and they got people to fund it, so it didn't cost them anything. But a machine, as you rightly say, I think sounds expensive. So I guess there's a number of things I would do to reduce the risk early on. You talked about customer testing. I would have probably come up with 5-6 different value exchanges, and worked out what I thought was value for the customer and tested it with people to say, if you want to get on this bus, will you do it for 10 seconds? Will you do maybe jumps rather than squats? Some of those things that maybe is less cost for the customer. And also the value you provide might be different. You might give them a free meal. You might take them on the bus. It might be a bike. I don't know, but I'd test it. The kind of, once let's say you land on that value exchange of it's exercise for a bus, I feel there's a much cheaper way to test it than building a machine. Thinking simply, I could stand there. I could stand at the bus stop, offer someone that if they do 20 squats, I'll go up to the bus driver and I'll pay for it.
Yeah.
I don't have to build a machine. I don't have to build a software to issue tickets. I simply, as a human, kind of go and do that. Now, that's probably cheaper. I can test it. I can remove it. Maybe I pay 30 people to do it and stand around the town. At some point, you might scale it and you need to get a machine in, but I don't think you need to do that initially. I think there's a much cheaper way to build a test that effectively is manually operated to do it.
You're absolutely right, and I think this touches on some of the points that we've made already, which is the testing. This is super important, but tests don't have to be things that are enormously complicated and enormously expensive. I think the truth is, as long as you're able to validate that key assumption, which is, like you said, we've identified a way that we think we can exchange value. Let's test whether or not people actually will accept that value exchange. We'll actually go through with it. So I think to round up, Toby, our first episode back.
It's been a bit rusty.
It has been a bit rusty.
Been a few glares on stats.
That's right. There have been a few glares on stats, but we'll get better as time goes on. Like whatever. Like a fine wine, Toby. We'll get better with age. So I think just a few takeaways for the podcast. I think for this first episode, the first one that really stands out to me is that people aren't using these benefits as much as you think they are, or as much as you might want them to. Because I think if we're all honest and we have a look at how many value-added services we receive from some of the companies we engage with, very few of us are using them or feeling the value from them, probably that the companies want us to.
Yeah.
But that doesn't have to be the case. I guess the way I think about this is that value exchange is hugely important, and maybe that would be my second takeaway, is that actually if you can get that value exchange right and you can be a bit more clever and a bit more inventive about what customers really value, what is it they really want. So just because we want people to get healthier doesn't mean I need to give them a free smoothie or I need to give them the gym access. People might want to say, if I'm going to put in the exercise, I want you to pay for my bus fare because I'm going to be knackered by the time I've done my squats. I would encourage companies to do the same, which is, if you really want to get that kind of, short-term pain now for long-term benefit, for the benefit of you as a company, for the benefit of your customer, for the benefit of society, truly dig into what that value exchange looks like. What are people willing to give you for what you need right now? And what do they expect in return?
And I think if I guess, riff on that and kind of take it a bit further, my key takeaways, and I probably hadn't thought about it enough before we kind of sat down and talked about this planning and then today, is there doesn't need to be that link between the kind of value you're providing now and the long-term benefit. Because as you're right, as long as that value exchange is fair, it can be quite a kind of, I guess, loose link between the two, and you can actually be much more creative and inventive about where you're doing this and how you're providing it. And you don't need to think, I need to have a direct, strong link between the two.
So, Toby, I think we have covered it, despite you probably upsetting everybody from the city of
Cluj Napoca.
There we go.
The
town of Cluj Napoca. I think we've covered that. So I think super interesting topic to start us off. We are back next time to talk about something much more insurancy. We're actually going to talk a bit about claims, and something that I'm keen to talk about, regardless of whether anybody wants to listen to me or not. Passionate about it. So, so we'll be back for the next episode to talk a bit about claims. But until then, Toby, thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.